Hello and welcome to the first episode of Faulkner Fridays. I'm your host, Quentin, and today we'll be talking about William Faulkner's most difficult novel, The Sound and the Fury. But before that, if this is your first time meeting me, my name's Quentin. I am a PhD student of English. I study Faulkner and Modernism. I'm also a teacher and a writer, so I kind of do YouTube more frequently now than I used to. It's nice to have you, and I look forward to seeing you around for more Faulkner Fridays. Without further ado, let's get right into the video. When we think about the history of the English language, we usually imagine dictionary, formal grammar, or the slow evolution of words over centuries. We think of Shakespeare inventing new expressions on the fly, of grand shifts in pronunciation, or of how Old English gradually weathered and reshaped itself into the language we speak today. But every so often, the English language changes into a completely different way. It changes not because new words are added to the lexicon, but because a single writer discovers that language itself can do something no one ever thought it could do before. Some writers expand our vocabulary, while others expand our imagination, and a rare few, however, expand the very possibilities of English prose. And William Faulkner belongs to that final extraordinary category. The Sound and the Fury is not simply one of the greatest American novels ever written. It is a novel that permanently changed what English prose is capable of expressing. If you've ever tried reading The Sound and the Fury, you probably experienced something like this. You begin reading the first chapter, and within the first few pages, you've lost track of who's speaking. Time seems to jump without warning. One sentence belongs to the present, while the next seems to belong 20 years earlier. Characters appear before they've even been introduced. Conversations dissolve into raw memories, and absolutely nothing seems stable. Many readers reach this point and assume they are reading the novel incorrectly. I know that I did. The immediate temptation is to think Faulkner is simply being difficult for the sake of it. But what if the confusion isn't a structural flaw? What if it's the entire point? What if Faulkner isn't trying to merely describe consciousness, but is instead trying to make us experience it firsthand? That single question completely changed the way I read this novel, and I think it is a question that ultimately unlocks the entire book. To understand why The Sound of the Fury feels so vastly different, we have to take a step back for a moment. For much of the 19th century, novels followed a similar, comforting rhythm. Time moved predictably forward, events happened one after another, and narrators guided readers carefully from beginning to end. Language behaved almost like a clear, clean window. Its main purpose was to simply help readers observe an objective world. Of course, every novelist of this era had a highly distinctive voice. Dickens doesn't sound like George Eliot, and George Eliot doesn't sound like Thomas Hardy. They shared one incredibly important assumption: that human experience could be accurately represented through orderly narration. Then the 20th century arrived, bringing with it a tide of massive disruption. Industrialization rapidly transformed everyday life, cities ballooned, and the trauma of the First World War shattered long-held confidence in human progress. Meanwhile, the emerging field of psychology challenged our most basic assumptions about how we think. Sigmund Freud proposed something deeply unsettling: that much of what governs our behavior exists far beneath conscious awareness. Memory is not orderly, identity is not fixed, and the human mind does not move neatly from one to the next. Instead, it wanders, it associates, and it constantly interrupts itself. If that is how consciousness works, how could the traditional novel continue pretending otherwise? That dilemma became one of the defining questions of modernism. Modernist writers answer that monumental question in vastly different ways. James Joyce revolutionized the interior monologue, while Virginia Woolf dissolved the boundaries between perception and narration. William Faulkner, however, did something uniquely his own. Rather than abandoning the English language, he radically reshaped it. He stretched its syntax, fractured its chronology, and allowed different narrators to physically reshape language according to the specific ways they experienced the world. In The Sound of the Fury, English no longer functions as a neutral instrument that simply records events. Instead, a language becomes memory, perception, and trauma. Each narrator speaks a completely different version of English, not because they inhabit different countries, but because they inhabit entirely different forms of consciousness. The result is a novel that asks us to stop treating language as a transparent window onto reality. Instead, language becomes the very medium through which reality is created. That central idea I want to explore throughout this series and throughout this video, but overall with Faulkner. My argument's not simply that Faulkner wrote difficult sentences. Many writers have managed to do that. Rather, my argument is that The Sound of the Fury represents a profound turning point in the history of literary English. Through fiercely fragmented syntax, shifting narrative perspectives, and deeply experimental chronology, Faulkner permanently transformed English into a language capable of expressing memory, trauma, subjective consciousness in ways that previous generations of writers could scarcely imagine. To see exactly how he accomplishes this, we have to begin right where the novel itself begins, with Benjy. And in doing so, we begin with one of the most extraordinary narrative voices ever committed to paper. By this point, we can begin to see that The Sound of the Fury isn't simply telling us its story differently. It is asking us to read differently. And that distinction matters. When most of us open a novel, we automatically assume we are moving chronologically through time. Page 1 becomes page 2, yesterday becomes today, and one event leads naturally into the next. Reading feels almost effortless because we've spent our entire lives learning that stories unfold in a neat, linear order. Faulkner quietly, completely removes that certainty. Instead of asking us to follow time, he asks us to move through consciousness. That may sound like a subtle difference on the surface, but it isn't. It is a completely different way of thinking about what a narrative can be. One of the critics who helps explain this profound shift is the French narratologist Genette. Genette makes a fascinating, counterintuitive observation. He argues that a written narrative does not actually exist in time the way life does. Instead, a text exists in space. As readers, we don't simply sit back and watch time pass before our eyes. Rather, we travel through the physical space of the text itself. In a standard novel, the layout of that space is designed to mimic the steady march of a forward march of a clock. But in The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner dismantles that illusion entirely. By treating the page as a spatial canvas rather than a chronological timeline, he turns reading into an act of active navigation, forcing us to wander, get lost, and map out consciousness from the inside. As Genette writes, the temporality of written narratives is to some extent conditional or instrumental, produced in time like everything else. Written narrative exists in space and space, and the time needed for consuming it is the time needed for crossing or traversing it, like a road or a field. I absolutely love that image. A reading comes less like watching a clock tick away, and more like physically walking through an open, unfamiliar landscape. Every sentence we read is another step we take, and every paragraph changes the literal terrain beneath our feet. This image helps explain something absolutely essential about Faulkner's work. When we become deeply disoriented in The Sound of the Fury, it isn't because the novel has stopped making sense or because the prose is broken down. It is simply because the landscape itself has changed, and we are challenged to find our footing in a brand new world. Another scholar, Cohn, takes this discussion one step further. Her work asks a deceptively simple question. How does language represent thought? She isn't asking how language represents outward speech, nor how it describes physical action, but how it captures the silent, mercurial process of thought itself. Cohn argues that fiction possesses a unique, remarkable flexibility in this regard. The English language has the capacity to move almost seamlessly between describing the cold details of the outside world and allowing us to fully inhabit the warm, subjective space of another person's mind. It is exactly this flexibility that Faulkner stretches to its absolute limit, showing us just how deep into the subconscious prose can go. As she explains, we can now profile the narrated monologue more sharply by examining its linguistic relationship with its closest relatives. First, with the two rival techniques for rendering consciousness. Second, with the narration of fictional reality generally. What Cohn helps us recognize is that modernist writers didn't simply destroy grammar. Rather, they radically transformed its purpose. Under their hands, language no longer exists merely to report external events or describe physical actions from a safe distance. Instead, it begins to intimately imitate the very rhythm of thinking itself. That shift may well be modernism's greatest, most enduring linguistic achievement. By turning the sentence into a mirror for the mind's private moments, writers like Faulkner stopped treating syntax as a rigid set of rules and began treating it as a living map of human consciousness. Faulkner takes that possibility further than almost anyone before him. He doesn't merely describe consciousness, he builds sentences according to the way consciousness actually behaves. Each of the four main narrators speaks an entirely different English. Benjy's language follows raw sensation, Quentin's follows painful obsession, Jason's follows bitter resentment, and Dilsey's follows quiet endurance. Ultimately, the grammar of each section changes because the minds driving them change. Once we recognize this, the novel begins to look very different. We are no longer asking the traditional readerly questions, what happened first? Instead, we are asking ourselves, how does this particular person experience reality? That is an entirely different and much more profound question, and it is one that Faulkner spends the entire novel answering. Literary critic David Minter argues that this transformation didn't emerge out of nowhere. Faulkner was deeply indebted to the 19th century novel. He read it carefully. He admired it, but he also recognized its limits. Minter writes that Faulkner's work explores the structures of consciousness, the examination of language as a medium of play, and the problematic relationship between fiction and reality. I think that's exactly right. Notice that Minter doesn't describe language as a neutral passive tool. Instead, he describes it as something Faulkner actively experiments with, almost like a scientist testing the limits of a powerful new instrument in a laboratory. These are are the precise questions Faulkner keeps asking throughout his work. What happens if a sentence follows memory instead of chronology? What happens if grammar begins imitating thought? What happens when language refuses to separate the past from the present? By treating language not as a static vessel to hold a story, but as a dynamic medium to be tested, stretched, and rewritten, Faulkner doesn't just capture consciousness, he proves that prose itself is an open frontier. And perhaps no critic captures the experience of reading The Sound and Fury better than Clint Brooks. Brooks argues that Faulkner doesn't simply describe his characters. Instead, he forces us to inhabit them. As he writes, we do learn what it is like to live in such a family through being forced to share the minds of the three brothers and their special kinds of obsession. That single word, force, is incredibly important. Most traditional novels allow us to observe characters from a comfortable, objective stance, but Faulkner completely dismantles this bound. We don't watch Benjy think. We are forced to think with Benjy. We don't analyze Quentin's haunting obsession from the outside. For a few dozen pages, we become trapped directly in it. Jason's bitter transactional worldview isn't merely described to us, it becomes the tight, relentless rhythm prose itself. That is one of Faulkner's greatest, most radical innovations. Language no longer simply reports consciousness, language becomes consciousness. And that brings us to an important realization. Everything we've discussed so far has been preparation. Faulkner isn't merely trying to make an abstract argument about language, he is actively demonstrating it. Each section of The Sound and the Fury becomes its own distinct experiment, a different way of testing whether the English language can faithfully represent the complexities of the human inner life. The first and perhaps most astonishing of those experiments belongs to Benjy Compson. He remains, in my mind, one of the boldest, one of the most radical narrative voices written in English. We've talked about modernism, and we've talked about the theories, but now we finally arrive at the novel itself. When do we get here? Faulkner makes a truly remarkable decision. He doesn't begin with the family's patriarch, nor does he begin with the long history of the Compsons. He doesn't even begin with a narrator capable of explaining what has happened. Instead, he begins with Benjy. For many first-time readers, this choice feels almost cruel. You are dropped headfirst into a world without orientation, where time shifts without warning. People appear before you know who they are, and entire decades disappear in the space of a single second. It is incredibly tempting to assume Faulkner is simply trying to confuse us. I don't think that's true. I think he's trying to teach us an entirely different way of reading. Benjy doesn't experience time the way most of us expect. He doesn't organize life into years, chapters, or neatly ordered memories. Instead, he organizes his world through raw sensation, a sound, a scent, the smell of rain, or the feel of cold grass. One physical sensation immediately awakens a deep-seated memory, and suddenly the past isn't the past anymore. It's happening again. Notice what Faulkner has done with this approach. He hasn't merely written about memory. He has changed the structure of English so that sentences themselves begin behaving exactly like memory. While the grammar remains relatively simple, chronology quietly disappears. The novel no longer asks us what happened next. Instead, it asks, what does this moment remind Benjy of? That is an entirely different, revolutionary form of storytelling. One sentence captures this transformation better than almost any other. Thinking about Caddy, Benjy simply says, "Smelled like trees." That's it. Only 4 words. There is no explanation, no psychological analysis, and no clinical attempt to tell us why Caddy mattered. At first glance, the sentence seems almost too simple. Yet, it remains one of the most beautiful and evocative lines Faulkner ever wrote. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever smelled fresh-cut grass, a specific perfume, or bread baking and instantly found yourself transported somewhere else? It doesn't happen because you actively chose to reminisce, but because the memory arrived long before the conscious thought. That is exactly how Benjy experiences the world. For him, smell isn't merely attached to a memory. Smell is memory. Faulkner refuses the ease of abstract language. He never flatly tells us that Caddy is loving, nurturing, or innocent. Instead, he gives us a raw, physical sensation. Somehow that brief sensory flash carries more emotional weight than pages of psychological explanation ever could. It is a remarkable achievement. English no longer depends upon abstract vocabulary to communicate deep emotion. Instead, concrete experience becomes the very grammar of feeling. Returning to literary scholar Cohn, she argues that fiction possesses a unique ability. The language of the novel increasingly resembles the internal movement of consciousness rather than the explanatory voice of an external narrator. Language can move from describing the outside world to allowing us to completely inhabit another person's mind. Benjy's section in The Sound of the Fury may be one of the greatest examples of this ever written. We aren't merely observing Benjy from a safe, comfortable distance. Instead, for a few pages, we actually begin thinking the way he thinks. His unique consciousness becomes the very architecture of the novel. This is one of Faulkner's greatest innovations. Language doesn't simply describe perception. In Benjy's hands, language becomes perception. If Benjy experiences memory as innocence, Quentin experiences memory as imprisonment. Everything changes the moment we enter his section. The sentences grow longer and more tangled. Thought interrupts thought, and punctuation begins to collapse entirely. Time refuses to move forward, and the language itself feels utterly exhausted. Why? Because Quentin cannot escape the past. Every attempt to move forward only circles back to memory, and every present moment is haunted by another that came before. That isn't simply difficult writing for the sake of being difficult, it is deeply psychological writing. Faulkner is allowing grammar itself to bear the heavy, suffocating weight of Quentin's suffering. One sentence has always stayed with me. Quentin remembers his father's words. I give you the mausoleum of all hope and desire. What an extraordinary image. Think about what a mausoleum actually is. It's a place built to preserve the dead. In giving Quentin his watch, Mr. Compson isn't offering him wisdom, confidence, or a hopeful inheritance. He's giving him a tomb. Within this symbolic gift, hope and desire have already been buried, and the future itself has become something static, preserved rather than lived. An astonishing moment of meaning is compressed into this single metaphor. Family, history, time, grief, memory, and loss are all held together by a single dark image. This is a defining way modernist language transforms English. Rather than dryly explaining the idea, it concentrates that entire emotion and philosophical weight into a single unforgettable image. Literary theorist Kathy Kurth offers another way of understanding Quentin. She argues that trauma rarely returns as a straightforward memory. Instead, it arrives indirectly through repetition, interruption, silence, an unexpected association. Once you begin reading Quentin through that lens, his narration suddenly makes much more sense. He almost never confronts his pain directly. Instead, his thoughts constantly circle around it, approaching, retreating, repeating, and breaking apart. This fragmentation isn't decorative, it is deeply psychological. Trauma inherently resists orderly narration, so that language itself must become disordered. That is why Quentin's section can feel so utterly overwhelming. We aren't simply reading about a traumatized consciousness. For a little while, we are trapped inside one. By now, a larger pattern is beginning to emerge. Each narrator speaks a different English, not because Faulkner simply enjoys stylistic variety, but because every individual consciousness reshapes language into its own unique relationship with reality. Benjy gives us the language of raw sensation, while Quentin gives us the language of haunting obsession. Next, Faulkner introduces someone who, on the surface, seems much easier to understand, Jason Compson. And as we've seen, the clarity is precisely what makes him so dangerous. After Benjy's fractured sensory world and Quentin's collapsing consciousness, Jason almost feels like a relief. His sentences are shorter, his thoughts appear more orderly, and time once again moves in a straight line. For the first time in the novel, we feel like we're actually reading the words of someone who knows exactly what he thinks. But Faulkner is doing something wonderfully deceptive here. Jason's language is clearer, but his mind is not. In many ways, Jason possesses the most limited consciousness in the entire novel. Not because he lacks intelligence, but because he completely lacks imagination. Under Jason's gaze, everything becomes too simple. People are reduced to categories. Relationships become mere transactions. And compassion is written off as weakness. This destructive simplification appears again and again in his language. At one point, he dismisses women with brutal, flat certainty. Quote, once a bitch, always a bitch, what I say, end quote. The sentence is grammatically uncomplicated, almost blunt, and that is precisely the point. Unlike Benjy, whose language opens up raw emotional possibilities, or Quentin, whose language reveals an unbearable complexity, Jason's language exists to close off interpretation. Nothing is allowed to remain uncertain or mysterious. Everything is judged and filed away immediately. This is one of Faulkner's quietest and most profound achievements. He showed us that language does not merely reveal personality, it reveals the exact limits of a person's moral imagination. Jason isn't trapped off by difficult syntax or a mind unraveled by trauma. Instead, he is trapped by his own easy certainty. Then, something remarkable happens. After 3 sections dominated by intensely subjective narrators, Faulkner steps back. The final section abandons first-person narration altogether, and for the first time in the novel, we are allowed to breathe. Many readers describe this shift as a return to objective narration, but I don't think that's quite right. It is something even more interesting. Only after we have lived inside the fractured, chaotic worlds of Benjy, Quentin, and Jason can we finally recognize what genuine perspective looks like. And that perspective belongs not to a Compson, but to Dilsey Gibson. Throughout the novel, the Compsons possess wealth, education, and social standing. Yet none of these things grant them wisdom. Dilsey possesses something far more valuable. She endures. A single sentence captures her entire life. I've seen the first and the last, Dilsey said. Never you mind me. It is one of the most beautiful and resonant lines in American literature. Notice what Faulkner does here. He gives the novel's greatest moral authority to a black woman speaking in Southern vernacular. On the surface, her English differs from standardized literary English, and some readers might even dismiss it as uneducated. Yet Faulkner asks us to do the opposite. He asks us to hear its profound wisdom. Grammar is not the measure of truth, and dialect is not the measure of intelligence. Dilsey understands the Compsons more deeply than they understand themselves. This may be one of Faulkner's most radical ideas. The language historically pushed to the margins becomes the very language that sees most clearly. By now, we've probably answered the most persistent question. Why do so many readers struggle with The Sound and the Fury? The answer seems obvious. The novel is notoriously difficult. It took me about a month, 2 months to read it and reread it to fully understand it. So the difficulty is completely understandable. Benjy's memories, constantly interrupt themselves, and Quentin's thoughts collapse under their own weight. Chronology completely disappears and traditional transitions vanish. Faulkner simply refuses to explain. All of this is true, but I don't think difficulty is the novel's real subject. Imagine for a moment if Faulkner had written the story in perfectly orderly Victorian prose, each memory neatly labeled, each timeline explained, and every emotional conflict translated into clear exposition. It would certainly make the novel easier to read, but it'd also be deeply dishonest. Consciousness doesn't work that way. Memory doesn't arrive politely, and trauma doesn't wait its turn, and our minds certainly don't move in straight lines. So why should this novel? Ultimately, the difficulty isn't the obstacle to meaning. The difficulty is the meaning. Faulkner asks us to experience consciousness before asking us to understand it. That, more than anything, is why this novel continues to capture and challenge readers after almost a century after its publication. So when we began this conversation, I suggested that the history of English isn't only the history of changing words. It is also the history of writers who discover new possibilities hidden inside the language itself. William Faulkner is undeniably one of those writers. He didn't reject the English language, he transformed it. Through the lens of The Sound and the Fury, we see this transformation occur in real time across 4 distinct voices. Benjy taught us that memory can become grammar, while Quentin showed us that syntax can bear the weight of trauma. Jason revealed that language can expose the limits of moral imagination, and Dilsey reminded us that wisdom belongs to no single dialect or social class. Together, these 4 voices accomplish something extraordinary. They expand the very boundaries of what English prose can express. That is why The Sound and the Fury still matters. It is not simply because the novel is famously difficult, nor is it because of its massive literary influence. It is because it fundamentally changed the relationship between language and consciousness. It taught English how to think differently, and once that happened, the novel could never quite be the same again. If you made it this far, thank you. I hope this conversation has made The Sound and the Fury feel a little less intimidating and a little more astonishing. I really love Faulkner, and The Sound and the Fury was one of the first Faulkner books I read. I think the first one I actually read was Light in August, and then I read The Sound of the Fury. It's a difficult book, and it's not my favorite one. My favorite one is Absalom, and that's a far more difficult one, but it relates to the Compson family. If there's another great work of literature you'd like me to talk about, or there's a particular work of Faulkner that you wish for me to tackle before anything else, please let me know in the comments. And thank you for joining me on this first episode of Faulkner Friday. And to all the casual academics and all the people who wish to dive into one of American literature's greatest writers, thank you for joining me and reading beyond the syllabus. Until next Friday, I hope to see you all again very soon. Bye.